My name is Paul Shoemaker, and I am the chairman and founder of Decision Strategies International, and I also teach at the Wharton School where I am a professor. And this module is about how to improve your strategic thinking as well as your decision-making capabilities. The most important part of being strategic is to notice that the world is changing around you. And most people are quite late in picking up the signals that this is in fact happening. I've listed here on the slide some examples of companies that were blindsided by important developments in technology, important developments in economics, in social issues, and in the political realm. For example, the whole development of LED, light-emitting diodes, was really seen somewhat late by the light bulb manufacturers. And in the United States, for example, some of the three largest companies, General Electric and Philips from the Netherlands, Philips Electronics, and Osram Sylvania, part of the Siemens Group, really lost a good part of the traffic light business to LED companies that replaced the traditional lighting fixtures with light-emitting diode components, and that was nearly $1 billion market. So this is not vigilant. This lacks the ability to pick up signals, weak signals from the periphery. Even a company like Microsoft, which is a very intelligent and capable company, was blindsided by open software as well as by Netscape as well as by Google. So there's no shortage of examples where people miss important developments. And this is really about the topic of peripheral vision. Are you able to pick up in time developments outside of your area of focus that may have a significant impact on your business? And we published an article in the Harvard Business Review called Scanning the Periphery. And the current slide here is a survey that we can conduct. The survey is in the article, and we ask two questions. How complicated is your environment? How much do you need to have good peripheral vision? If you're in a very complex environment, you have a high need. If you're in a simple environment, you don't need that much peripheral vision. Just like driving a car in Mumbai or Jakarta, you better have very good peripheral vision, especially if you're not from the country, because things are pretty chaotic. But if you're driving in the countryside and there's no other cars, and all you have to watch out for is that you yourself don't fall asleep, your need for peripheral vision is much lower. We can also measure, and we do measure in that article through about 15 or 16 questions, how good are you at scanning the periphery? What is your capability in this key domain? And this has a lot to do with how well you think strategically, whether you have a culture that is externally oriented, how your organization is structured, because sometimes the way you are departmentalized or how your functions are set up may create blind spots. And above all, how well knowledge is shared across organizational boundaries. And in our surveys of thousands of managers, we find that the majority of companies fall in the quadrant here that is labeled vulnerable or myopic. That is, they operate in an environment that is quite complex. Much is happening with customers and suppliers and regulators and partners and the economy and technology and media, and they are not able to quickly enough spot it. So that's a problem. If you are in the vigilant quadrant, you're in a complex environment, but you're very good at it, no problem. Then you have, if you will, 20/20 vision. Likewise, if you're in a rather simple environment, but you have, and so you can have a laser beam focus, you don't need to worry too much about everything that is happening around you. And there's a few companies, not many, that actually are in a simple environment, relatively speaking, but they get very exercised and upset about changes in the environment, so much so that they overdo it and they become, in a sense, neurotic. They have attention deficit disorder, if you will, the affliction that children sometimes have. So this is all about how good are you at balancing learning and performance. Most companies need both cultures. Typically, organizations start as learning cultures. They very inquisitive, externally oriented. They try things. Information is not overly political. Risk-taking and therefore mistakes are somewhat tolerated up to a point, of course. And the organization is very good in crossing functions. They may have cross-functional teams that work quite well without turf battles. Once these learning organizations, such as Apple in the early days, become successful, and this happened at Apple when the Macintosh in the early 80s, 1980s was introduced, often these companies become much more performance-oriented. They become more disciplined. At Apple, they hired a new CEO, John Scully, who came from PepsiCo, and he created a very disciplined organization to optimize and benefit from this wonderful product they had, the Macintosh computer. So he developed a clear standard operating procedure manual. He became much more internally oriented to have more disciplined processes. He started to manage the company much more by the numbers, holding people accountable for what they had promised, and perhaps also by fear, which is not always the best way to manage people. He really expected consistency of delivery, didn't really care for too much ambiguity or deviations from plan, and the company became pretty rule and procedure oriented. And for a while that worked well. Apple was selling the Macintosh fine, but the downside was that eventually many people that had joined Apple in order to revolutionize the world, including Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak, but also initially 10 and eventually 100 software writers, left the company because they felt the soul of the company had changed away from innovation and learning to exploitation, not in the negative sense, but in the sense of taking a good hand of cards and milking it for all it's worth. And the reasons I think that companies don't get the balance right and get blindsided is sometimes that leaders are not really proactive, but they're very narrowly focused on the current business, and they're not that curious about what is happening 2 or 3 steps removed from their own business. Other times it is because the strategic planning process is not an outside-in process, but rather inside-out. In other words, they start with their own business and how much they want to grow, what their market share and rate of return on investment should be, and then often the planning process becomes quite political, and it's maybe not as intellectually honest as when you start by saying forget who we are and go outside in and say let's see how the world is changing around us in terms of social, political, economic, technological changes, and then let's figure out a way to benefit from that. It may also be that you get blindsided because your culture is very inward-looking. You're not willing to listen to mavericks, to scouts, to customers who leave you, to partners who are not totally happy with you. The more you have a market-driven culture, meaning you focus on customers above all and then competitors as well, the less likely it is that you will be blindsided. Also, the whole attitude towards information sharing, especially across organizational boundaries, across functions, business units, divisions, with partners, with suppliers, is, I think, an important indicator. And lastly, sometimes organizations are structured in ways that don't let them see what's really happening around their business. A good example is Barbie, which is owned by Mattel. Barbie lost a lot of market share to a doll called the Bratz doll, and the main reason was that Barbie had a male and a female, a boys and a girls division, and the problems that Barbie had, which is not being attractive as a doll for older girls, girls over 10 wouldn't play with Barbie anymore. Ken had the same problem. Ken is the male doll, and if only Barbie and Ken had been speaking more often, they would have realized that this was a common problem having to do with shifts in society, with media, with electronic entertainment, video games, etc., and they wouldn't maybe have been hurt as badly. This gets us all to the topic of how well we are thinking and reasoning and perceiving what's going on. The field of decision-making or decision sciences is quite broad. It consists of very quantitative techniques called decision analysis. It also is taught outside of economics and business schools and statistics departments, in language departments and in logic and in psychology. So that's the topic of critical thinking. There's a lot of good ideas about how to be more creative. Think of de Bono's 6 hats. And there's an exciting new field called behavioral decision theory, which has given rise to behavioral finance and behavioral economics. And that field really focuses on where human beings often miss the boat, why they become biased. In a book that I co-authored with Jay Russo called Winning Decisions, we present the map, the model that's on this slide. We talk about how important it is to really spend a lot of time on framing and reframing your decisions, and then on asking the right questions and getting better information, and also to be quite clear about what your objectives are. What are you trying to accomplish? And the blue arrow speaks to the importance of learning from not only your own experience, but other people's experience. And in the middle, we talk about a meta decision, like metaphysics, something that overarches this framework, which is deciding how to decide. If you have a problem, you should really ask, where is the challenge in this problem? Is this more a framing problem, defining the issues? Is this more a data or information problem? Is this perhaps a problem that's all about knowing what you really want, what's important to you? Or is this a problem about not making the same mistakes that other people have made? And we've seen in our executive education programs with MILD and other programs that often there's a shift, away after people have been trained, a shift away from spending a lot of time on collecting data and agonizing about what to do, and the shift is to spend more time on the framing part of the process and more time on the learning part of the process. And we think that is this is a good reallocation of time and effort. So if we relate this back to strategic planning and how to think about the future, it's important to realize that in the past, the strategic planning was much more financially driven. It was much more number oriented. So level 1 and 2 planning in this slide really assume a stable world that can be extrapolated from where the past is a good indicator of the future. If you know the trends of the past, you can pretty much see or predict the future. But in the 1970s, when we had major oil shocks, a new kind of planning became important, where the focus is much more on strategic thinking, especially on challenging your own assumptions. The problem is not only that you don't have good information maybe about the external world, but that the way you think about it, that your mental models are maybe outdated. You look at maybe new data through old mindsets, and this is blinding you perhaps to important developments. So once this ability to think strategically is more deeply developed in the company, then it goes really to level 4, which is strategic management. And eventually, the current topic of interest is how you manage uncertainty better. Another book I wrote is called Profiting from Uncertainty, and there we lay out a soup to nuts scenario-based strategic planning process that starts with the external environment and goes all the way down to implementation. And the key is that if the uncertainty is high, you need a different toolkit than if you're dealing with problems that you know a lot about and have quite often experienced. So the traditional tools, the ones that we, on the left bottom of the slide, the things we teach in typically in MBA programs, are very good for problems that are well structured, where there is little uncertainty, or there may be risk, but you can put probabilities around it. And this includes techniques like forecasting and net present value analysis, and decision trees, and simulation, and portfolio optimization. And these are good tools, and they are quite sophisticated. The problem is that sometimes our problems are much more to the right. We're dealing with issues where we don't have really good probabilities, or we don't even know what the problems are. We're dealing with ambiguity or even chaos, as happened during the financial crisis. Or we are quite ignorant about the issues because it may be new research that we're doing in the laboratory, or we may be going into an emerging market where we have little experience. And then I think it's dangerous to use these traditional tools from the left and apply them to problems that are on the right of this spectrum. Instead, we should be using some newer tools that are much more aimed at helping you think in a creative but also critical way about the problem, These tools are not so analytical, they are softer. They include influence diagrams to really understand the many causal influences in a complex system, scenario planning, real options analysis, when to use intuition, more complete risk management, not just quantifiable risk management, and above all to instill a learning culture, because the question on the right is not how can you optimize the problem. The question on the right is how can you accelerate your learning, and if you make wrong assumptions, how can you quickly find out that you're making incorrect assumptions. So the metaphor in terms of planning is moving away from controlling risk, which is one common metaphor, and that's what often managers desire, to I think a more realistic metaphor, which is you have to navigate the uncertainty. Just like a captain on a ship would never say that they control the weather, or that they control the currents, or even that they control the pirates if they happen to be in dangerous waters. The best they can say is, I will navigate. I will try to figure out a way to go from A to B and deliver the cargo without sinking the ship. But it requires a great sensitivity to the external environment and a strong ability to adjust to unexpected changes, be it in weather or in current, or your engine suddenly not working, or a mutiny on the ship, or many of the things that can happen. And that's what we try to do in scenario planning, is map out the range of possible futures. So in this slide, you see sort of a cone, and we start in, let's say, 2010, and then we don't know quite how the future is going to evolve. And you might set up a cone that covers with 90% probability the range of possible futures. The farther you go out, the wider the range of possibilities becomes. And since there are really hundreds of, if not thousands of possible outcomes or scenarios in a business, it gets to be too difficult to consider them all. What is simpler is to develop maybe 3 or 4 or 5 stories about what could happen in the future. But as long as these stories are at the boundary of the cone, such as the ones that are labeled A, B, C, and D, then if you can test if your strategies are strong enough to survive these 4 more extreme scenarios, then you can also be quite confident that they can handle anything that lies in between. And that's really the idea behind scenario planning, is to stress test how robust your plans are. So the way we build scenarios is, for example, to start by looking at all the forces that are causing change in your industry. We might call these the drivers of change. And then we split these into 2 categories: the things that are really long-term trends, things you're willing to bet your future on, such as the aging population in Western Europe, or improvements in technology, or making it more wireless, or faster, or cheaper. These may be long-term trends that you can safely bet on. More people using the internet is a safe trend in many countries. And then there are those things that are really hard to predict. What's going to happen, to the revolution that is sweeping some of the Arab countries? What will the President of the United States be re-elected? Which party will be in power? And if you want to be more sophisticated, you can spend a lot of time looking at the interactions between the trends and the uncertainties. But the idea basically is not to get confused by the many, many factors, the many trees in the forest. The idea is to see the forest from a larger perspective. And we do this by developing just a limited number of scenarios that bound with some confidence the range of possibilities. So for example, when we did this with credit unions, and think of those as community banks that are non-profit and owner or member or customer owned, we started with the current situation, and then we did some interviews with people in the industry. We identified the forces, the trends, the uncertainties impacting the industry, and then we used a technique of a 2x2 matrix and a blueprint. But essentially at the end of that process, we had 4 different views that where the future might be. And one of those was called credit union power, and that's a quite status quo scenario. Not much was going to happen. Another scenario has a lot of deregulation, where anybody can go after a customer with financial offerings. We call that wallet wars. Yet another scenario says there's still going to be a lot of regulation, but the game is really shifting towards a technology-intensive world. There won't be branches anymore. It's mostly going to be call centers, kiosks, internets, websites, and the like. And then there's a world where both things might change. The regulations may change a great deal, and the technology. And then you have to be almost like a chameleon, like the animal that is able to change its color so that it fits again in the new environment. You have to be very flexible. And it's not only a question of building the scenarios, but then once you have them and you have formulated a good strategy, then the challenge is to also monitor how things are changing. And you may be a year into your scenarios, 3 years into your scenarios, and it's important to see where are we now. And one way we do this is by creating a dashboard, by saying, okay, the last half year, the following things happened, and some of these made one scenario more likely and another scenario less likely, and the dashboard shows quarter to quarter or year to year maybe how the likelihood of scenarios have changed. So if you click on the red arrow, you can see why it moved away from its blue position, the old position, and it lists all the things that happened in the last quarter that we think caused the change. I've written a few books on these topics, which are on this slide, and it starts with books mostly dealing with critical thinking and decision making and the traps we fall into. Then we get a set of books that deal much more with how to apply this sort of fundamental basis of judgment and decision making to the world of business, such as how to profit from uncertainty using scenario planning, how to increase your capacity to look at the periphery and pick up early warning signals, and even a book that we wrote on what might be the future of the pharmaceutical industry and the biotechnology industry and the diagnostics industry because of all these new technologies which we may not want to use because there's lots of ethical issues as well as economic problems associated with applying them and having our population become older and older. So the book Chips, Clones, and Living Beyond 100 looks at that. And I'm currently completing a book that will be out in November through the Wharton Digital Press in November 2011. And that book is called Brilliant Mistakes: How to Find Success on the Far Side of Failure. And that's furthermore a book that really is aimed at fostering learning cultures. Are you willing to not only learn from your mistakes, but are you willing to make more mistakes on purpose to improve your learning? As Tom Watson once said, if you want to succeed faster, make more mistakes. And these are some of the topics that we are covering in the program at Mile, which I hope you will at some point be able to join in and participate in.